We're going to look now at a report released by Oxfam today, which has accused Australia's big four banks of backing companies that have, well, been allegedly kicking people off their land in so-called land grabs. I'm joined by the Oxfam Chief Executive, Dr. Helen Zoeke, who's also in Melbourne this morning. Dr. Zoeke, thanks for your time. Now, give us a sense of what this report has found and what Oxfam is alleging today.
Well, what Oxfam's report has found is that Australia's big four banks have all been involved in investing in companies overseas where there's evidence that the land has been acquired illegally or through invalid leases, and this has really resulted in people being left homeless and hungry.
Is this what you mean by the land grabbers, as you're referring to it in this report? And is it likely that the banks were aware of that the companies were involved in this behaviour?
Well, a land grab is the expression that's used where companies take over land and force people off the land without adequate compensation or without ensuring that they're resettled appropriately. The report actually details 4 case studies which apply to each of the 4 banks, the ANZ, the Commonwealth, the National Australia Bank and Westpac, and it demonstrates that either through their own audit practices or through independent audits that have been done by governments or other international instruments, that there have been unethical practices in play. This is an example of where the big four banks have invested in business where they have information which tells them that those businesses aren't operating within an ethical, sustainable or sometimes legal framework, and are involved in practices which result in people being left hungry, without their homes, forced off their lands, without adequate compensation.
How much responsibility do you believe the banks have to ensure that they are investing responsibly in circumstances like this?
Well, Australia's big four banks hold themselves up internationally to be leaders of the pack in terms of sustainability and ethical frameworks. We think that this is a great opportunity for them to actually have a direct impact on the lives of people who are poor, who are often subsistence farmers who've been forced off their lands, and they can do this through their investment practices. We've seen in the case of multinational companies like Coca-Cola and Pepsi, where they've been given evidence that where they source their sugar from large sugar plantations, where those plantations have been operating on land that's been acquired illegally, multinational companies have said we will have a zero tolerance policy to land grabs. If we think that Coca-Cola and Pepsi can do it, we think this is a great opportunity for Australia's big four banks to continue to show international leadership and to actually ensure when they're investing in companies, they make sure those companies are operating in an ethical and sustainable way.
Westpac, in a statement, said it welcomed Oxfam's investigation and said it exposed useful information in drawing further attention to some of the complex issues the banking sector has long been managing. The ANZ as well said in the past it has exited customer relationships in circumstances where the customer is unwilling to work collaboratively with the ANZ towards meeting their standards. Now, from those 2 banks, your immediate response to that reaction? It sounds like they're going to be positive, proactive in response to your report.
Well, we're encouraged by some of the responses from the banks, but when you think about the lives that are actually affected in Cambodia and Indonesia and Papua New Guinea and Brazil, which is where these case studies have come from, I think we really want the banks to be much more robust in actually dealing with the evidence that's been presented in this report. Evidence which, by the way, the banks have already had in terms of understanding the impact of their investment, and we want them to be much more robust. We don't want them to pull out of those relationships with the investing in those companies. We actually want them to use the billions of dollars of Australians' money that's invested in these companies to force those companies to change their practices. At the end of the day, we want to ensure that people who are living in poverty, who are living really on the edge of these large sugar plantations or logging plantations where the environment has been impacted and where they can't look after themselves, that they get adequate compensation.
You said billions there, but what sort of magnitude of investment are we talking about?
Well, we understand that the combined exposure of the top 4 banks is in excess of $20 billion in these overseas investments in agri-businesses of one sort or another. So that's over $20 billion worth of the average Australian depositor and investor's money that's exposed in terms of these investments. And in some cases, where in the example of Brazil, for example, the Brazilian government has actually indicated that the land has been acquired illegally and should be given back to the landowners. In the case of Papua New Guinea and the Westpac Bank, we've actually seen that the Papua New Guinea's own Commission of Inquiry has said that the lease of the plantation is illegal and should be revoked. Where we see that banks like Westpac and the Commonwealth Bank are involved, where the governments of those countries have actually said the land acquisition is illegal, then what that tells us is that there's an exposure there in terms of the money that's been invested. There's a financial exposure. This is not just about reputational loss on the part of the banks.